short break. It probably won't be our full 20, but just if you're wondering, are we going to be pushing through? No, we all need to stay well. And so we're going to take another break eventually this afternoon. Mr. Slisher, you may call your next witness.
Thank you, Your Honor. The state calls Jody Stiger.
You can stand right here. Sir. Raise your hand. Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth and nothing but the truth?
Yes, I do.
Have a seat. And if you wouldn't mind, if you would use this to grab that stylus that's there and give it to me. All right. Thank you. And we're going to swap it over. And I'd ask that you remove your mask if you feel comfortable doing so.
Yes, sir.
And let's begin by having you state your full name, spelling each of your names.
Yes, sir. Jody Stiger, Jody Stiger.
Mr. Slisher.
Thank you, Your Honor. Sir, how are you employed?
I'm employed with the Los Angeles Police Department.
In what capacity?
I'm a sergeant.
And you understand that you're here today serving as a retained expert for the state in this matter, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
So this is outside your typical duties as a sergeant with the LA Police Department, correct?
Yes, sir. I'm on vacation.
All right. Well, welcome to Minnesota.
Thank you.
Sir, before we begin your testimony, I'd like you to just introduce yourself and share a little bit about your background with the jury. First, how old are you?
I'm 50 years old.
Okay. And you indicated that you're currently a sergeant with the LAPD. Can you please describe for the jury how you came to be involved in law enforcement?
Yes. So shortly after leaving the Marine Corps, I joined the Los Angeles Police Department in April of 1993. Yesterday was my 28-year anniversary. I did the police academy. After graduating the police academy, I was assigned to a patrol division, and from there I was recruited to work undercover in the high schools to buy drugs.
In Los Angeles high schools?
Yes.
Okay, and you were working as an undercover?
Yes.
How long did you have that assignment?
Approximately 6 months.
What did you do after that?
After that, I was assigned to another patrol division in South Los Angeles, Southwest Division, near the campus of University of Southern California. And I worked there until 1998.
All right. And what were your duties just generally as a patrol officer in that particular area of Los Angeles?
For the first 2 years of patrol, was just handling calls for service primarily. During that time, it was a pretty violent time in Los Angeles. I believe on average, in our division, we averaged anywhere from 100 to 200 homicides a year. So it was a pretty dangerous area.
Okay. And after then, you said you held that position as a patrol officer for how many years?
Just for patrol specifically, I was there for 2 years, and then I was recruited to work the gang unit at the same division.
In the same geographic area?
Yes.
Describe that work for the jury.
It was primarily gang intelligence. I was assigned a specific gang and neighborhood, and our assignment was to gather intelligence, make arrests, and handle any calls of service that were specific to that specific gang.
How long did you work in the gang unit?
In that specific gang unit for 3.5 years.
Okay. And where did you go after that?
I was recruited to go and work at FBI task force in the same bureau for specific to that gang that I was assigned to in Southwest Division.
And was that more of a long-term investigation?
Yes, so we were doing investigative work, and so basically we handled all crimes other than murders and sexual assaults that were committed by that specific gang.
Right. And how long did you do that?
I did that for approximately a year and a half.
Then where did you go?
Then I was recruited, and I was assigned to the training division at our for in-service tactics.
And approximately what year was that?
Approximately 2000.
And what did you do for your in-service tactics unit?
For the in-service tactics unit, we developed a 32-hour course. It was the first of its kind for the Los Angeles Police Department. It was a 4-day course where we went over de-escalation, firearms manipulation, basic patrol tactics, and arrest control techniques.
And what was your assignment afterwards?
After that position, I was promoted to sergeant.
And you spent some time on the use of force board for your department?
Yes, as a peer member.
What does that mean?
So the way the Los Angeles Police Department's use of force review is set up is there's 3 stages. So you have initially you have a use for, these are for the higher profile uses of force, not all uses of force. The higher level uses of force. So you have a use of force review board that convenes, and there's 4 command staff and 1 peer member. So depending on the officer involved, if it's a police officer, then you have a peer that's an officer. If it's a sergeant, detective, so on and so forth. And so I was a peer member from 2003 until 2007. So I was a peer member as a police officer as well as a sergeant, where I sat on the board as a board of 5 people, 4 command staff and the peer, and basically we review all the information that was gathered during the investigation, and we make recommendations to the chief of police. At that point, the chief of police then gets that information, he makes a recommendation to the police commission, and then the police commission has the final say.
And what you're reviewing is actions, conduct involving uses of force of other officers, is that right?
Yes, sir.
And then what was your next assignment after serving on that board?
That was just an adjunct duty, so I was called as needed. But as I stated earlier, I was promoted to sergeant in 2006, and I was assigned to our central division, which is downtown Los Angeles.
What was required to become a sergeant for the LAPD?
You have to take a written test, and once you pass the written test, you also have to go through an interview process, and then you're ranked. You also have to have a certain amount of college credits in order to be eligible to take the test.
Okay. You were then eventually selected as sergeant. Can you tell the jury what your first duty was as a sergeant?
Yes, my first duty was assigned to our central division, which is downtown Los Angeles, in the Skid Row area.
In the Skid Row area?
Yes, sir.
And doing what?
I was a patrol sergeant, a field sergeant.
So describe what that job was like. What were you supposed to do?
General duties of a field sergeant is supervising officers assigned to a specific watch. Normally, anywhere from 10 to 20 officers would be assigned to a specific watch, and you maybe 1 or 2 supervisors that are assigned to that watch as well. And you have general duties such as providing roll call training in the early beginning of the watch, as well as just overall supervision, making sure that officers are conducting themselves properly, as well as if there's a use of force, you have to respond to the use of force and take the use of force investigations as well.
And did you take a different position after serving as a sergeant?
I'm still a sergeant, but yes, within about 6 months, I was assigned to our Safer Cities initiative, which was focused on the homeless problem in Skid Row area. So I did that for the next year and a half.
Now, you've described a couple of geographic areas of Los Angeles in which you've served as a patrol officer and a patrol sergeant.
Yes.
I'd like you to please just describe in general terms those areas in terms of the dangerousness or the crime rate there.
Well, in my first assignment in South Bureau, South Bureau historically has the highest violent crime in the city. Central Bureau and Central Division usually is second or third.
Right. And what kind of crimes are you typically responding to?
Primarily violent crimes, robberies, assaults, things of that nature.
And I'd also like you to just describe for the jury the training that you received in the use of force and defensive tactics to help you do your job as a patrol officer and a patrol sergeant.
I was unique in a sense because I was a tactics instructor for 6 years, so I had a lot of background in use of force and tactics prior to making sergeant. Prior to that, as a patrol officer, we would get quarterly training as well as annual training that would keep us up to date on any changes in laws or policy and procedures.
And what does it mean to be a tactics instructor?
For our department and for the state of California, you have to go through different types of training. So I've been through our force options instructor training as well as de-escalation training. I'm a trainer for de-escalation, force options. I've been through the FBI range matcher course, so I'm a handgun instructor as well, and a number of leadership courses as well.
And have you had an educational role or a teaching role within your department?
Yes, as I stated earlier, for 6 years I was a tactics instructor for in-service training for the course I had mentioned earlier.
So this would, in-service training would be for already serving officers, is that right? Experienced officers?
Yes.
And it would be in the form of annual training?
Yes.
During that annual training, would you provide training as to your department's use of force policy?
Yes, and state law.
And state law. And have you reviewed generally use of force policies and across the nation and compared those with the use of force policies in your department?
Yes, so at my current position, I am the aide to the Inspector General, which is an oversight entity that is within the Los Angeles Police Department, independent of the department itself. I'm the only sworn officer that works for that unit. There's 28 overall employees. During that time, during my time there, I was able to travel nationwide and go to a number of different police agencies to basically compare their use of force policies as well as their training with Los Angeles Police Department.
And are your policies in the Los Angeles Police Department fairly consistent with the policies and standards nationwide?
Yes, sir.
Is there sort of a nationwide sort of acceptable reasonableness of a police officer that's generally accepted in your field?
Overruled.
Yes.
Getting back to your days as a trainer for defensive tactics and instruction, approximately how many Los Angeles police officers did you provide training in that 6-year time period?
In the initial 6-year time period, approximately 3,000 officers.
And can you explain to the jury the types of training that you provided, the specific topics?
As I stated earlier, the main focus was de-escalation. We taught them basic patrol tactics such as vehicle stops, pedestrian stops, as well as firearms manipulation, and ultimately we would do, at the end of the 4-day course, the goal was for them to utilize their de-escalation tactics so they wouldn't have to use force.
Did you teach specific tactics, ground training, or anything like that?
No, we taught all the subjects.
Right. Now, you indicated in your current role with the department you do use of force reviews. Is that correct?
No, not in my current role.
In a prior role, I should
Yes.
say you did. Okay. In terms of the use for force reviews and the numbers of use of force reviews that you've completed in your career, can you estimate approximately how many you've done?
Approximately 2,500.
And of those 2,500 force reviews, have you ever made findings that the use of force was excessive or objectively unreasonable?
Yes.
And have you ever made findings where such use of force was not excessive?
Yes.
And when you've done use of force reviews, has that included the review of the use of deadly force?
Yes. In certain situations, primarily in that role. After being a patrol sergeant, I was promoted and assigned to be a training coordinator for South Bureau, which is pretty much all of South Los Angeles. In that bureau, we had approximately 1,600 officers, and at the time it was 4 patrol divisions and 1 traffic division. And so my job was to oversee the training for that bureau.
Are you a member of any professional organizations?
Yes, I'm a member of a few.
Could you name them, please?
Employee organization, the Oscar Joe Bryant Foundation, which represents African American officers on the police department. I'm a member of the I'm drawing a blank, I'm sorry. A number of them. I'm trying to not say the acronyms because then I got to say them all out. But a number of other police organizations that involve tactical managers.
And have you been called upon by other law enforcement agencies to provide instruction in the use of force?
Instructions specifically, no. I've consulted with a number of other agencies.
Consultation of use of force reviews?
Yes.
Okay. What other agencies have you assisted?
I've assisted the University of California, Office of the President. I've assisted King County, Office of the Ombudsman. I've assisted California City Police Department, as well as the University of California, Irvine Police Department.
Did you, and you have indicated already that you've been retained as an expert witness for the state in this matter, is that right?
Yes, sir.
And you've conducted then a review of some of the various materials associated with the death of George Floyd that happened on May 25, 2020, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Do you charge a fee for your services?
Yes.
And can you please tell the jury what the fee is in this matter?
There was a flat fee of $10,000, and for trial, the fee is $2,950.
And that has included reviewing all of the different offense materials that you were provided, is that right?
Yes, sir.
And could you please tell the jury, just in general, high-level terms, what offense materials you have reviewed?
I reviewed all the body-worn videos, all the other videos that were provided to me that were cell phone videos, pulled videos, things of that nature, reports, manuals from the Minneapolis Police Department, as well as the training materials.
One moment, if we may have a sidebar, Your Honor. All right, based upon your review of the different materials that you have conducted in this case, and based upon your own experience and training in law enforcement, have you reached an opinion as to the degree and amount of force used by the defendant, Mr. Chauvin, on George Floyd?
Yes.
And can I ask you to explain to the jury a little bit about what process or methodology you go through to render such an opinion?
There's a few steps. The main step is going through the objective reasonableness standard, which is based off of Graham versus Connor. You're looking at the seriousness of the crime, looking at the person's actions, things of that nature, as well as looking at the specific agency's policies and procedures as well.
Okay. In addition to the seriousness of the crime under the Graham standard, do you look at any other factors?
Yeah, I try to look at a number of factors. What was known to the officers at the time. And again, like I stated, one of the biggest things I look at is what was the person's actions at the time that the officer was using force.
All right. And based upon your review of these materials and in light of the Graham factors, what is your opinion as to the degree of force used by the defendant on Mr. Floyd on the date in question?
My opinion was that the force was excessive.
Before we then talk about the specific basis for that, we need to define a few terms. And what is force?
Force could be typically what officers would use in a law enforcement perspective. Obviously, force is different techniques and tools that officers may use to try to take someone into custody or apprehend the person or to control them.
Can force include a restraint?
Yes.
If I may show you Exhibit 17, which has been received into evidence. All right. Can you describe what it is you see here?
I see a officer with his knee on the neck of Mr. Floyd.
Is this a form of force?
Yes.
Now, and you can remove Exhibit 17. Oh, I'm sorry. That was supposed to be published.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay. If you could republish the exhibit then, 17. This is specifically what we're talking about in terms of the force you were reviewing. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
And the force that you stated in your opinion was excessive, is that the force that began right around the point that Mr. Floyd was on the ground?
Yes, sir.
All right. Now, I'd like to then focus your attention to the Graham versus Connor factors. You indicated that one of the factors that you consider is the severity of the offense being investigated. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
And do you recall what was the severity of the offense being investigated here?
If I remember correctly, it was Mr. Floyd was accused of having a counterfeit $20 bill.
And how does that particular offense or the severity of the offense relate to the appropriateness of the force to be used against him?
Typically, in a normal situation where you're dealing with someone that's a counterfeiter or someone who is using a counterfeit bill, typically you wouldn't even expect to use any type of force.
When you're looking at in the Connor standard, the severity of the offense, is the label of the offense, be it a misdemeanor or felony, is that important?
In some cases, yes.
What do you find more important than the label of the offense?
The person's actions.
And so would it be fair to describe the counterfeit $20 bill as a fairly low-level offense?
Yes.
And in the Connor world, then, that would justify lesser force. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
Then the second factor is whether the person would pose some sort of an immediate threat. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Can you describe to the jury what is a threat?
A threat can be perceived as something where an officer feels that the person is going to assault them or going to assault someone else.
And is identifying a level of threat, is that an objective standard, a subjective standard? How is that viewed?
It could be subjective,
Okay. How so?
depending on the officer, their training and experience.
Okay. And when we talk about threat, I'd like you to distinguish between a threat and a risk. Is there a difference between a threat and a risk?
Yes.
Explain that difference to the jury.
So typically as police officers, anytime we go into a situation, there's a risk factor involved just based on the nature of policing. It's kind of, I try to describe it as, when I'm teaching, I describe it as if you're going into the middle of a movie and you don't know what's going on, so you're trying to figure out all the information as you're going through. As far as a threat is concerned, a threat would be once someone becomes combative or assaultive towards you or towards another person.
Now, what kind of factors can present a risk?
The location, just the mere call itself, the call for service, what the actual crime was.
What about the characteristics of the subject? What characteristics of the subject can pose a potential risk?
I'm sorry, could you?
For example, the size of the subject.
Yes, in certain instances, size and stature do make a difference.
Okay. In terms of a risk, is that right?
Yes.
Is the size of a subject, would a large subject necessarily constitute a threat?
No, not necessarily.
And why is that?
Again, it's based on the person's actions, not specifically just their size and stature.
And so in conducting a use of force review or looking at the objective reasonableness of force, is it appropriate to use force against an individual simply because of their larger size?
No.
And I'd like you to discuss the Connor standard of resistance, whether the person is resisting or attempting to evade law enforcement officers. Is that something you review?
Yes.
Okay. And were you able to make any kind of assessment in this case as to whether or not Mr. Floyd was offering resistance or trying to evade law enforcement officers?
Yes.
Okay. And what was your assessment?
Initially, when Mr. Floyd was being placed in the backseat of the vehicle, he was actively resisting the officers. So at that point, the officers were justified in utilizing force to try to have him comply with their commands and to seat him in the backseat of the vehicle. However, once he was placed in the prone position on the ground, he slowly ceased his resistance, and at that point, the officers, ex-officers, I should say, they should have slowed down or stopped their force as well.
Okay. Now, I'd like to back up to a certain point. You indicated.
Could you state the question again?
And so I asked you to make an assessment as to the reasonability of the force that was used by the law enforcement officers as it relates to whether or not Mr. Floyd was offering any kind of resistance. Is that, you recall that?
Yes, sir.
And I believe you indicated that Mr. Floyd was offering resistance initially outside of the vehicle. Is that right?
Yes, outside and inside the vehicle.
Okay. And then, however, there was a time that Mr. Floyd was taken outside of the vehicle and placed on the ground. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And you indicated at that point, after he was placed on the ground, the officers, what should they have done?
They should have de-escalated the situation, or attempted to.
And what did they do instead, based on your review?
They continued the force that they were utilizing from the time that they first put him on the ground.
Right. Now, I want to make sure that when we're talking about the evaluation of the use of force, you're evaluating this application of force from what perspective?
First, I look at it from a ground perspective, as well as the Minneapolis Police Department's use of force policy.
And is the standard then through the view of a reasonable police officer on the scene?
Yes.
And since we're talking about the actions specifically of the defendant, at what point are you going to be determining or considering the factors that were available to the defendant when he was applying force?
I'm sorry, could you rephrase that?
Yeah. So we know that there were some events that happened prior to Mr. Chauvin, the defendant's arrival on the scene. Is that correct?
Yes.
Right. But for the purposes of your review of the reasonableness of the defendant's actions, at what point do you begin your analysis?
Based on when he arrived and he became involved in the actual use of force.
And so, based on your review of the materials, what were the circumstances on the ground or at the scene for the defendant when he arrived?
When he arrived, after they removed him out of the vehicle and placed him on the ground, do you mean the Mr. Floyd's actions, or
what did the defendant see when he first arrived on scene?
He saw Officer Lane and King struggling with Mr. Floyd in the backseat of the vehicle.
Okay. And then what did the defendant do after he initially arrived on scene?
He went to assist those officers with attempting to place Mr. Floyd in the backseat of the vehicle.
And did you observe the body-worn cameras then of various officers at that moment that the defendant approached the vehicle?
Yes.
Okay. Describe what you saw as best you can recall when the defendant approached the vehicle.
They were attempting to place Mr. Floyd in the back seat of the vehicle. Mr. Floyd was actively resisting, moving around. He was attempting to get out of the back seat of the vehicle. Clearly, he didn't want to be back there. And the officers were trying to initially place him in the back seat, grabbing the seat belts and things of that nature. And then ultimately, the decision was made to remove him from the vehicle.
Okay. Now, at the point that Mr. Floyd was removed from the vehicle, right, when he was taken out of the vehicle and brought to the ground, do you recall what happened? How did the officers proceed to remove him from the vehicle?
Yes, so they were pulling him from the driver's side passenger door, which is the street side, and they were pulling on his legs and his arms, and once they got him out of the vehicle, they somewhat placed him on his knees, or he kind of went on his knees.
And so now getting back to before he was placed or was attempted to be placed in the back of the vehicle, do you recall what Mr. Floyd was saying when the officers were trying to get him in the back of the vehicle?
Yes, he was saying that he couldn't breathe. He was saying he was claustrophobic, and that he didn't like being back there.
Did you see him, or did you hear him indicate that he had anxiety and that he was afraid?
Yes.
answer is stricken.
And well, based on what do you recall Mr. Floyd telling the officers?
Numerous times he had stated that he was afraid. He had had COVID before and he couldn't breathe, and he had anxiety, and he was claustrophobic.
Now, based on those statements and the way Mr. Floyd was acting at the time, do you believe that what the officers did to try to get him in the vehicle in and of itself was reasonable actions?
Yes, it could be perceived as reasonable, yes.
But were there other alternatives that they could have done besides trying to force him into the back of the car?
Yes.
Calls for speculation, also beyond the scope of parameters of crime.
Sustained.
Was it necessary for the officers to use force at that particular point?
Objection, calls for speculation.
Overruled.
Not necessarily, no.
What else could they have done?
They could have continued to try to verbalize with him. It appeared early on.
Objection, calls for speculation.
I said overruled.
Please continue.
It appeared early on that the officer King had gained a slight rapport with Mr. Floyd early on, and so in police practices, it would have been best to try to continue to verbalize with him because he had gained a rapport with him, and try to get him to comply with his commands by verbalization.
But nonetheless, you believe, in your opinion, that it was not unreasonable for the officers to attempt to place him in the back of the car.
Correct.
And now I'd like to play a segment for you of what happens when they were getting him out of the car and initially placing him on the ground. So at this time, I'd like to publish the King body-worn camera, which is Exhibit 43, and I'd like you to please back that to 20, 18, and 46 seconds. Yeah. All right, if you could play.
COVID, man. I can't breathe. I
Take a
can't
seat.
breathe. Please, man. Please listen to me.
Is he going to jail?
Listen to me.
He's under arrest right now for forgery.
I tell you.
Can we figure out what's going on?
For what? Take him out. For what? Please, man. I can't fucking breathe.
Here, come on out.
Look at you. Thank you. Thank you.
Get him down on the ground.
Ah,
Yeah, on the ground. On the ground.
ah, my wrist.
Right. And so at the point, then they decided to bring Mr. Floyd out of the car, and you could see on the video, Mr. Floyd was initially brought to his knees. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
And what did you hear Mr. Floyd say after he was initially brought to his knees?
I believe he said thank you.
And if you could continue.
Right.
You got your restraint. Hobble.
Can't breathe.
Okay.
I can't breathe.
Grab that. Once we get him.
Jesus Christ. I can't breathe. I can't breathe. Thank you. I can't breathe. Ah,
Stop moving.
Mama.
Stop. Thank you. Now, after he was initially on his knees and they began to put him to the ground, is that correct?
Yes.
What position did the officers place Mr. Floyd when they brought him on the ground?
Prone position.
And what is the prone position?
A prone position is where you lay a person on their stomach, chest area.
And you can see that Mr. Floyd had already been handcuffed, is that correct?
Yes.
And so at this point, he is now prone on the ground, handcuffed, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Prior to him being in this position, did you see any aggressive actions or what could be interpreted as aggressive actions on the part of Mr. Floyd?
Prior to the prone position?
Prior to the prone position.
Yes.
What did you see?
He kicked his leg.
And could you describe that kick and how that might be interpreted by a reasonable police officer?
Yes, so the officers were still attempting to control Mr. Floyd at the time, and as they were trying to place him down in the prone position, I believe one of the officers was attempting to control his legs, and Mr. Floyd kicked their arms away in an attempt to try to possibly break free from the officer's grasp.
Aside from that one kick, did you see anything else in your review of any of the materials, the body-worn cameras, that would constitute an act of aggressive behavior by Mr. Floyd?
No.
And that was at approximately, what, 2019 and about 35 seconds, is that right?
Approximately.
And when we are evaluating then the restraint period, this is about the time we're starting, is that right? Right after he was placed on the ground prone.
Yes.
Did you hear the defendant ask a question regarding a restraint at that point?
Yes.
And what was he asking about?
I believe he asked for the hobble.
What is the hobble?
The hobble is a restraint that's used to bind a person's legs in order to control them better and stop them from either harming an officer or breaking property. In most cases, kicking out the windows of police vehicles.
And if I can show you, show the witness and not the jury. One moment, Your Honor. Witness Exhibit 200. Was that one received, Your Honor? 200. Oh. I'm going to ask you if you recognize what's shown in Exhibit 200.
Yes.
Does that appear to be the use of a hobble on a restrained person?
Yes.
Okay, I'll offer Exhibit 200 and ask to publish.
Any objection?
No objection.
200 is received.
And if you could publish, please. All right. Sir, is this the hobble restraint that you were referring to?
Yes, sir.
And when is this hobble restraint used?
Typically on someone who's actively aggressive towards the police.
And the person who you see in Exhibit 200, the hobble has been applied. What position is this individual in after this hobble has been applied?
The side recovery position.
What's the side recovery position?
Side recovery position is when you place someone on their either left or right side to assist them in being able to breathe better.
What's the purpose? Oh, I'm sorry. And you said it's to assist in being able to breathe better. Is that right?
Yes.
You familiar with the term positional asphyxia?
Yes.
What does that refer to?
It refers to when a person is in the prone position and while they're in the prone position, they have a difficult time breathing, and it may cause death.
Right. If you could remove Exhibit 200. All right. Now, once the officers had Mr. Floyd on the ground in the prone position, and you can see that he was handcuffed, and I'd like to bring a still image, Exhibit 255. That Exhibit 255, that's approximately where we left off in the viewing of the video. Is that right?
Yes.
Once that has been done, the officers here, after the kick, had an assessment to make. Isn't that right?
Yes.
and that is whether or not they would continue to use the hobble or begin to use the hobble.
Leading is sustained. Rephrase.
What assessment did they have to use, have to make at this point?
Well, based on the defendant's request for the hobble, they had to assess whether to continue to apply the hobble to the Mr. Floyd.
Okay. And based on your review, did they do so?
No, they did not.
What does that suggest to you regarding their assessment of the dangerousness or the need to restrain Mr. Floyd?
Based on my review, I would believe that they felt that he was starting to comply, and his aggression was starting to cease.
And was that consistent then with your own observations of what you saw Mr. Floyd do as the video continued?
Yes.
One moment.
Members of the jury, we're actually going to break for the day. And the sergeant will be back tomorrow, and we'll resume with his testimony then. Let's shoot for 9:15 again, so the normal process. All right, thank you.